Welcome to the Exodus and Beyond. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we will be exploring the Exodus from an esoteric understanding as explored in my book, The Exodus and Beyond, Book 2 of Unlocking the Dream Vision. In this video, we'll take our first looks at the beginning of the great Exodus out of Egypt. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one, to the many mysteries we will explore. As with the biblical story, our starting is the beginning of the 18th dynasty and the Hyksos expulsion by the Egyptians. Once the Egyptians had reestablished their control of Upper and Lower Egypt, they began to expel the people of the lower classes of the many tribes that made up the Hyksos. At the same time, they began enslaving all the elites of each of the tribes, including the Hyksos priesthood. This event that becomes known as the first expulsion of the Hyksos is the first exodus that Josephus and Apam both recount in their works. What became of these 480,000 people is unknown. They seem to have simply disappeared into the sands of history without leaving a trace behind. As for the Hyksos elites, they had been enslaved, and they began a prolonged and humiliating enslavement as the lower classes in ancient Egyptian society. A slave that served as a common household servant, a person of such low standing they would not be remembered because their names would never be written down, and therefore be denied an afterlife. As we discovered in the last video, the individual that's remembered as Moses in the Bible may have been a child of a high-ranking Hyksos who was a slave in service of Pharaoh's house or court. At some point in his early life, he was seen as a young man of talent and was picked out for greater things, either by Pharaoh or a member of his court. He would have been taken into Pharaoh's house and thus educated and trained as an Egyptian. According to the biblical story, this was undertaken by the Pharaoh's daughter. Over time, he would be groomed as an approved mediator for the head priest of the Hyksos, entirely loyal and under the control of Pharaoh, but also somebody that would be acceptable to the Hyksos. At some point in this young man's life, there was a change of heart, and he wishes to help his fellow enslaved Hyksos. The biblical account is rather vague on the details, but Moses kills an Egyptian he saw abusing a fellow Hyksos. It is this crime of murder that forces Moses to leave Egypt and enter the wilderness to escape Egyptian justice. Because of our better understanding of the events surrounding this enslavement, and because of something we will learn much later on in the story, we can speculate with confidence that it's probable that the event of Moses murdering an Egyptian on behalf of a slave is a highly sanitized version of a small uprising in the court of Pharaoh that was led by Moses. An uprising that was quickly crushed by the forces of Pharaoh, but in the process it resulted in the death of at least one Egyptian, and this would have forced the young Moses to flee into the wilderness to escape a painful, humiliating, and most likely public death. He would have been viewed as a traitor by the Egyptians, with it being equally possible that the enslaved Hyksos may also view him as some type of traitor. This would have left him with no place to hide within Egypt. In such a scenario, it would make the Egyptians, as with all the governments in history, launch a new program of oppression against the Hyksos slaves. According to both the biblical account and the dream vision of Enoch, the Egyptians begin a program of destroying their little ones by casting their young into a river of water. Although this sounds horrible to our modern sensibilities, it was a common approach in the ancient world when major powers began wiping out a people, especially one that had started any type of uprising or rebellion. They would begin by punishing the enslaved adults by taking their children and selling them into slavery to a foreign buyer. If the children was an infant or was just too young to be sold into slavery, primarily because no one would buy it because of the extra care that would be needed to raise it, it would just be killed. It would also not be uncommon for the Egyptians to torment the parents by forcing them to witness this killing, which in this case was by drowning them in the waters of the Nile. While these events are occurring, Moses is said to have encountered a God who claimed to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and who manifests himself in the form of a burning bush. Moses is then instructed by this God of Abraham to return to Egypt and free his people from Pharaoh's bondage. Upon his arrival, both the biblical account and the dream vision say that he is first met by Aaron, who then they both go and meet with the elders of the tribes, who Aaron speaks on Moses' behalf. And Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel, and Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken unto Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and he had looked upon their affliction, they then bowed their heads and worshipped. Exodus chapter 4, verses 29 through 31. After this meeting with the tribal elders, the Bible then tells us that Moses and Aaron then meet with Pharaoh, whereby the famous words, "Let my people go," are uttered. What is truly remarkable in this entire situation is that Moses was able to be included in a meeting with the elders of Israel, and then was able to meet with Pharaoh thereafter. The key to understanding how something like this could have happened is Aaron, with the most straightforward explanation being that he must have been the high priest or shaman of the Hyksos. This would explain how a man believed to be a criminal and possibly viewed as a traitor by both the Egyptians and the enslaved Hyksos was able to stand before the elders of the tribes and then receive an audience with Pharaoh himself without being arrested. Only a man who had such standing and control of the entire community could call such a meeting or provide such protection to Moses from the Egyptians. By realizing that Aaron was the high priest of the Hyksos, who at this point are an enslaved people who must have always been a great threat to the Egyptians, it is not any real surprise that the meeting with Pharaoh went poorly, and that Pharaoh is presented as having a very dismissive attitude toward Moses and Aaron and their people in general. It also helps explain why Pharaoh reacted so harshly to their request to release the Hyksos from their bondage by commanding their taskmasters to increase their burdens. This new oppression helps make the elites of the Hyksos begin turning against Moses and Aaron. These events in turn lead to the famous 10 plagues of Egypt. Within our journey through the dream vision of Enoch, we explored the events surrounding this great exodus out of Egypt and how it is possibly related to the radioactive traces found in Icelandic marine sediment samples, and that were dated to approximately 32,000 BC. We also explored how this was evidence that some type of widespread nuclear event had occurred at around this time. However, we did not have the opportunity to explore the actual events of the 10 plagues or what type of nuclear event could have been needed to produce the event known as the 10 plagues of Egypt as they are recorded in the Bible. Based upon the radioactive evidence, it's blatantly obvious that there was a massive destructive event of a nuclear nature that occurred approximately 34,000 years ago. Additionally, the dream vision of Enoch refers to the Egyptians being blinded, which we speculated at the time could be the result because of the brilliant flash of light that is created when a nuclear device is detonated. We also have the detailed biblical account of the 10 plagues that paints a fascinating picture that is eerily similar to the effects of deadly radioactive contamination of the ecosystem. For us to continue with this line of speculation, we need to take a much closer look at the 10 plagues of ancient Egypt as they're recorded in the Bible. Returning to the biblical account starting in chapter 7 of the book of Exodus, verses 14 through 25, we are told of the first plague, the plague of blood that poisoned the Nile River, then all the waters of Egypt. It has been speculated by many people that an earthquake or possibly a volcanic event may have caused this poisoning of the Nile. The most common idea is that an earthquake caused a massive amount of deadly gases that could have been trapped under the Nile River basin to be released into the waters. Such an event would kill every living thing in the water, thereby contaminating the Nile and turning the waters red as the corpses of the fish began to decompose. Unfortunately, there is next to no evidence to support this hypothesis, nor does it explain the radioactive evidence or the other plagues. By taking the radioactive evidence into account and the reference from the dream vision of the Egyptians being blinded, we can speculate that the plague of blood may have been caused by the detonation of a nuclear weapon. What is truly remarkable is not only could a nuclear blast create the plague of blood as it is described, but the after effects of such a blast could also help explain the 9 other plagues. All we must do is perform a little thought experiment where we imagine what would happen if we were to detonate a nuclear weapon over the Nile River valley somewhere upstream of Egypt. An ideal spot would be where the Nile River was flowing in a relatively straight line over a roughly flat ground for a dozen or so miles. Looking at the map of the entire Nile River, we'll find that just south of Upper Egypt in the Nubian desert just before the third cataract of the Nile would be an ideal location. It would also be ideal if the weapon was detonated at just the right height over the river so that the fireball would come close to but not actually come into direct contact with the river's surface. If this was to happen, it would produce numerous unique effects upon the river and its ecosystem. The first thing that would happen is that after the weapon was detonated is that the water would absorb the bulk of the radiation and the water would become superheated. This combination of massive heat of the blast and the radiation it creates would both help to superheat the water. Microseconds later, the shock wave of the blast would hit the water with such force that it would turn any fish and other wildlife in the river into a bloody, boiling goo for miles in directions from the blast. This would contaminate the river and turn the water a nasty blood red color that would soon reek of death. This is eerily similar to what is described as the first plague of blood and the poisoning of the Nile. The story also says that it took 7 days for the river to clear and become usable again. This short amount of time for the contamination to be flushed out into the Mediterranean Sea supports the idea that it was a relatively localized event that only affected a dozen or so miles of the river. Chapter 8 of the book of Exodus describes the next 3 plagues that befell Egypt. The first was of frogs, the second was of lice, and the third was of flies. These plagues would, of course, be the natural byproduct of the Nile River being heavily contaminated, which would have simply drove these creatures away from it. Chapter 9 provides us with the next 3 plagues that befell Egypt, all of which help support the idea that it was a nuclear device that may have been used. The 5th plague is described as a pestilence or murrain, which is an antiquated term for a plague or epidemic that affects domesticated animals and crop blight. We're told that this plague falls across the Egyptian livestock and then in time begins killing them all. Interesting, the Bible says that the Hebrew cattle and sheep were unaffected by this pestilence. This plague that strikes the Egyptian livestock and crops, but not the Hebrews, fits the profile of what happens to selective radioactive contamination. The most likely reason the Hebrew herds were unaffected by this plague was because they were located just outside the radiation plume and were not exposed to the contamination or came into contact with the contaminated waters of the Nile. The 6th great plague that fell upon the Egyptians was one of boils breaking upon man and beast. The plague of boils is our first real description of what we now know as radiation poisoning, where the skin begins to blister from the direct radiation poisoning or from being exposed to or holding any contaminated items. The 7th plague is the one of hail mingled with fire. This plague has traditionally been misinterpreted with the general idea that the hail itself was on fire and burning with flame. However, this idea is incorrect based on our modern misunderstanding of the ancient archaic meaning of the word mingled. To our ancient ancestors, mingled meant to prepare by mixing and not the modern definition to bring or mix together 2 substances, usually without fundamental loss of identity. That may not seem like an important difference between the 2, but it significantly impacts our understanding of this plague. Because in our modern mind, mingle merely means mixing 2 or more substances together that do not undergo any chemical reactions. Example, if we mix sugar and salt together, it is still just a sugar and salt that are mixed together and they do not undergo any chemical reactions on their own, thereby turning into a new substance. However, to our ancient ancestors, this salt and sugar mixture would not be viewed simply as a mixture of sugar and salt. To them, it would be an entirely new substance that was both sugar and salt with the properties of both. They would not have identified it as being either sugar or salt while at the same time having the properties of both. They would think of the sugar and salt as being mingled together and creating an entirely new substance that had properties of both salt and sugar. Once again, this might seem strange in our modern way of thinking, but what it means is that this description given in the Bible of hail mingled with fire is describing something that is neither hail nor fire, but is a substance that had properties of both hail and fire at the same time. Which, if we think about it for a minute, is a rather good description of a highly radioactive fallout, debris, and other contamination that was mixed within storm clouds that would have been carried north by the winds. In its journey, this radioactive material would have been pushed higher into the atmosphere, where it slowly would have been coated in water ice, turning it into hail, which then fell to the ground over Egypt. This hail would have looked like regular run-of-the-mill hail at first, but for anybody that was caught out in it or tried to pick up any of this material, they would quickly receive radiation burns. The victim's exposed skin would feel as if it was on fire, and their skin would begin turning red and blistering very quickly, looking much like a second-degree burn. If an individual picked up some of this material and held it for any amount of time, the effects would worsen, and it could eventually cause additional destruction to the skin itself. If it was held for too long, it would eventually begin to resemble third-degree burns with the flesh turning black that would have quickly rotted off the bone. Such an event would be a gruesome sight and would have been unimaginably terrifying for the ancient Egyptians. To them, it would have been a hail mingled with fire because it looked like normal hail, but then it burned like the flame of a fire for any and all who touched it. Chapter 10 of the book of Exodus describes two of the three final plagues to strike Egypt, one of locusts and then one that is followed by 3 days of darkness, both of which again are easily explained by the after effects of the detonation of a nuclear weapon. The locusts would be driven out of the original blast zone, with them trying to move away from it, and the contamination at the same manner of the plagues of frogs, lice, or flies. This would have naturally driven locusts and any other insects straight up the Nile River Valley right into the heart of Egypt. The 3 days of darkness is much like the hail mingled with fire. It's just the remaining debris, fallout, and contamination of the blast that creates the ever-famous black rain that occurs after nuclear blast, slowly drifting over Egypt, blocking out the sun. Chapters 11 and 12 of Exodus give us the final and possibly most horrible of all the great 10 plagues of Egypt, the great death of the firstborn. Although radiation is not selective enough to kill only the firstborn, it would lay waste to the very young, especially infants. A more likely scenario would have been that the radiation would have killed many young Egyptian children, hitting the newborns the hardest, with the most probable reason of the story of the firstborn was simply so that God would not look like a horrible child killer of innocent children. The story was simply changed so only the firstborn died. Although this is still horrible, it is also highly symbolic, for the firstborn traditionally are the inheritors of the family's titles, lands, and wealth. So again, symbolically, this represents a direct and devastating attack on the very fabric of Egyptian society. After the death of the firstborn, in chapter 11 of the book of Exodus, we discover that the Hebrews, or as we now know them as the Hyksos elite, borrowed jewels from the Egyptians. It also presents Moses as being beloved by all, including the servants of Pharaoh. As with the death of the firstborn, this appears to be nothing more than the biblical writers presenting the ransacking of Egypt's many jewels and gold treasures in a positive light. Remarkably, this is very close to what Apon spoke of in his second Exodus. that a renegade priest named Ososeth led an army of 80,000 Hyksos that ravaged the lands of Egypt and took the treasures of Egypt while committing many sacrileges against the traditional gods and temples before leaving for the wilderness in an exodus out of Egypt. This is the critical connection that allows us to reconstruct the entire story leading up to the Exodus in a much more realistic chain of events that are rooted much more in history and less in religious tradition and interpretation. Once again, our starting point is when the Egyptians had retaken political and military control of Upper and Lower Egypt at the beginning of the 18th dynasty. During and after they had regained control, they rounded up all the Hyksos. They first forcibly expel all the common people that make up the lower classes. This is the first exodus of the 480,000 shepherd kings that Josephus speaks of and mistakenly connects to the biblical Exodus. After expelling the commoners, the Egyptians then enslaved the Hyksos elite as common house slaves and servants. Although the Hyksos elite are turned into slaves, the Egyptians left the Hyksos religious structure in place. The reason this was done was because the real political and social power of the Hyksos lay within the priesthood. This would have been the easiest way for the Egyptians to control such a large group of people who were always a threat to them. If the Egyptians could control the priesthood, then they could directly control the political system of the Hyksos, thereby controlling the entire community. This small insight allows us to understand for the first time on how the man remembered as Moses could have entered Pharaoh's household and how he came to have such influence and standing within the elites of the tribes. He must have been the son of a high-ranking member of the Hyksos leadership or priesthood who was also a slave to Pharaoh. He would have been handpicked at an early age, possibly by Pharaoh himself, to be raised, trained, and educated by Pharaoh's priests to be an advisor or possibly even a priest for the Hyksos. He would be one of their own, but he would also be loyal to Pharaoh. This would mean that the story of the baby Moses being placed within the ark and set upon the waters of the Nile, who was later found by Pharaoh's daughter, was written to hide this connection. Although it's highly probable that Moses was trained as an Egyptian priest, it is difficult to believe that the Hyksos would have accepted him as one of their own. It seems more likely that he would have had the role of being Pharaoh's official religious advisor to the Hyksos head priest. This would help to explain how Moses came to know Aaron. In this role as head priest, Aaron would have naturally had dealings with Pharaoh or with the representatives of Pharaoh. Strangely, according to the Bible, Aaron does not become the head priest of the tribes of Israel until after leaving Egypt. To help us understand this, we need to remember the tribal structure of the Hyksos and their enslavement. Before the events of the 10 plagues and the Exodus, it is likely that Aaron was viewed more as a shaman by the Hyksos than a priest in the traditional sense. For a shaman is normally thought as being a man of unquestionable knowledge and mystical power, for he is the one that is chosen by the gods and speaks with them on the tribe's behalf. Although he speaks to the god, he is also the one that provides hope, faith, leadership, and advice for his people in times of trouble. He's also the keeper of the history of his people. He was a man whose power and standing came directly from the gods and whose will could not be questioned by the people, including the clan leader or king of the tribes. To his people, he was much more than a simple priest or religious leader that followed some religious doctrine. He was in many ways the very heart and soul of the tribe. It was this type of man that Pharaoh's religious advisor would have had to deal with. A man that would have had the knowledge that would have allowed the man remembered as Moses to learn that he was actually a Hyksos and not an Egyptian. It would also have been where the young Moses would have begun learning of the god of the Hyksos known as Hadad. It was this knowledge that led this young priestly advisor from Pharaoh's court to organize an uprising that was quickly crushed by the Egyptian, an event that is remembered in the Bible as Moses killing an Egyptian and who was then forced into some self-imposed exile in the wilderness for fear of punishment from Pharaoh. During this exile, Moses encounters the god of the Hyksos, who manifests itself as a burning bush and instructs him to return to Egypt to free his people. Upon Moses' return, we're told in the biblical account and the dream vision of Enoch that he first meets Aaron, the shaman and religious leader of the Hyksos tribes. Soon after, they both meet Pharaoh and demand the release of their people. Pharaoh naturally flatly refuses and increases the enslavement of the Hyksos, or Hebrews. Pharaoh's refusal to free the slaves is the event that brings upon the Egyptians the 10 terrorizing plagues by the God of the Hebrews. These plagues would have caused chaos, confusion, and weakened the Egyptian state of power and control, regardless if they were natural or artificial. Pharaoh would have been forced to return to his capital in the city of Thebes in order to deal with this ongoing disaster. This would have allowed the Hebrews, under the leadership of Moses and Aaron, to begin an uprising. During this time, they looted Egypt of her many treasures and began an exodus out of Egypt. While Pharaoh was trying to get control over the disaster of the plagues, he would have received news that the enslaved Hyksos had risen up, looted and ransacked the country, and had begun leaving to the east. Pharaoh would have then ordered his remaining forces after the escaping slaves to punish them for their crimes and kill this Moses who had caused all these problems in the first place. These events bring us to the actual exodus out of Egypt, when 80,000 Hyksos, under the joint leadership of Moses and Aaron, leave the city of Avaris and the land of Goshen on the eastern part of the Nile Delta. Soon after, this brings us to the most famous and controversial part of the entire Exodus story, the crossing of the Red Sea, which we will explore in our next video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos.